Have you ever wondered what it was really like to be a poor peasant on the road in the Middle Ages? Not knights, not nobles riding in carriages, but the ordinary traveler with nothing more than blistered feet, a ragged cloak, and a half-eaten crust of bread. For the medieval poor, stepping outside your village wasn't an adventure, it was almost a death sentence wrapped in mud and bad luck. Yet sometimes, duty or desperation forced peasants to leave home, maybe for a pilgrimage, seasonal work, or running away from debts that had grown larger than your last onion harvest. But the real question is, where did they actually sleep when night fell? Because inns weren't for them. Inns cost money. And money was the one thing a peasant didn't have. So tonight, let's walk in their shoes, or more likely, their bare calloused feet, and uncover the strange, uncomfortable, and sometimes darkly hilarious places where peasants tried to rest their heads. If you were lucky, very lucky, your night's stay might be inside a barn. Now, barns were built for animals, not people. But when your choices are freezing under a tree or cuddling with a cow, suddenly the barn feels like luxury. A barn offered a roof, straw for bedding, and giant animals that radiated body heat like living furnaces. Curling up between two oxen was the medieval equivalent of central heating, dangerous if they rolled over. Yes, but at least you weren't shivering in the mud. Of course, there was a catch. You couldn't just barge in. You had to knock on the farmer's door, beg for mercy, and pray he wasn't drunk, angry, or already hosting another traveler. If he allowed it, you'd find yourself sleeping alongside chickens, rats, and the ever-present perfume of manure. But compared to what came next, a barn was paradise. What if the barn door slammed shut, the monastery turned you away, and the tavern laughed at your empty pouch? Then you had no choice, you slept outdoors. Fields were the classic choice. Soft grass if you were lucky, thistles and cow dung if you weren't. You never slept in the middle though, too risky. Better to curl up at the edge, away from angry farmers and stampeding cows. Forests were another option, but they came with paranoia. Every twig snap was a bandit, every owl hoot a sarcastic reminder that you were one bad dream away from being wolf food. Sleep in the woods, and you didn't really sleep, you drifted in and out of a nervous half-coma, praying to wake up with all your limbs still attached. And then there was the weather, cold, damp, and merciless. A cloak made of rough wool might keep you alive, but it smelled like wet dog and had the insulating power of a cabbage leaf. But hey, at least sleeping outdoors was free. If you wanted both protection and irony, you headed for the churchyard. Graveyards were surprisingly popular among traveling peasants. Why? Because they were semi-protected, public, and best of all, the dead didn't complain. Sleeping in a churchyard carried a sense of spiritual safety. Bandits were less likely to rob someone snoring beside a saint's tomb. Plus, many churches had sheltered porches called lick gates where a weary traveler could curl up under cover. Of course, this wasn't always welcomed. Monks and priests weren't thrilled about their holy grounds turning into peasant campgrounds. You might be woken at dawn by a broom to the ribs. And if it was near a feast day, you'd find yourself surrounded by other peasants who had the exact same idea. Still, there was comfort in sleeping beside the dead. If you woke up soaked and freezing, at least you could mutter, "Well, at least I'm not that guy." Monasteries were the medieval version of a charity hostel. Under the rule of Christian hospitality, monks were supposed to treat strangers as if they were Christ himself. That sounds great in theory, until you realize it meant soup so watery it tasted like sign and cold stone floors for a bed. You couldn't just stroll in, either. You waited at the gate for hours until someone decided you weren't a heretic, a thief, or worse, a talkative heretic. If approved, you'd get a place to sleep, maybe in a guest hall or just a drafty corridor, plus a bowl of vegetable mush that barely counted as food. At 3 in the morning, you'd be woken by monks chanting in Latin, which sounded less like music and more like bees trapped in a church bell. Still, compared to the woods or a graveyard, a monastery was warm, dry, and safe. Just don't ask for seconds at dinner. That only earned you extra prayers, not extra portions. Too poor for an inn, too unlucky for a monastery. Then you aimed for the roadside shrines. These little stone or wooden structures dotted medieval roads, tiny chapels with statues of saints or holy relics. For peasants, they were sacred snooze booths. If you were lucky, the shrine had a roof or an overhang where you could huddle, knees to chest, pretending the cold stone was a mattress. You couldn't expect food or blankets, but you did get one priceless perk: plausible deniability. If someone caught you snoring, you could always mumble, "I wasn't sleeping, I was praying." Ah, the tavern, the medieval truck stop. If you had a few pennies, you might get to spend the night indoors at an alehouse. But don't picture comfort. Picture chaos. Taverns were loud, smoky, and smelled like beer-soaked regret. If you had money, you might rent a straw bed in a corner, shared with strangers who snored like warhorses. If not, sometimes innkeepers let desperate travelers sleep by the hearth in exchange for buying a drink and telling a good story. Privacy didn't exist. You were shoulder to shoulder with strangers, hoping the rats stayed on the other side of the room. The floor was sticky, the air was suffocating, and fights broke out almost as often as songs. But it was warm. And in the medieval world, warmth was worth more than dignity. If no barn, no tavern, no monastery, and no shrine worked out, you turned to the most desperate strategy: knocking on a stranger's door. This was medieval roulette. Sometimes a kind family took pity on you, letting you sleep near the fire and maybe even feeding you stew. Other times, the door was answered by a dog, and the night ended with you running barefoot through the mud. Those who welcomed travelers usually offered the least glamorous corner of their home straw on the floor, maybe near the goats. But it was dry, it was warm, and if you behaved, you might leave in the morning with bread in your pocket. Of course, not everyone was kind. Some strangers scammed or robbed travelers. But desperation often left no other choice. When all else failed, peasants turned to the town marketplace. By day, markets were chaos stalls overflowing with goods, merchants shouting, animals wandering. By night, they turned into ghost towns. Empty stalls, overturned carts, scraps of food left behind. For a poor traveler, that meant shelter. Sleeping under a market stall wasn't glamorous. It smelled of onions and fish, and the night watch might kick you awake if they caught you. But if you were careful, it was central, semi-covered, and close to the tavern if you got desperate again. Plus, if you woke up early, you might scavenge a stale loaf or half a turnip. And in the peasant economy, that counted as a win. Finally, there was the most practical option: sleeping with animals. Whether it was curling up with sheep, leaning against an ox cart, or squeezing into a goat shed, animals provided heat. They didn't ask for money, They didn't judge your ragged clothes, and they didn't laugh at your empty purse. The only real downsides: fleas, lice, and the occasional kick to the ribs. But many peasants considered that a small price for surviving another night. And remember, this wasn't just the trip out. Once your work, pilgrimage, or escape was over, you had to do it all again on the way back. By then, your cloak was torn, your shoes long gone, and you were about 30% more lice-infested than when you started. But you were wiser. You knew which barns had the soft straw, which taverns watered down their ale the least, and which roadside shrines smelled less like goats. You left home a naive traveler. You returned still a peasant, but a peasant with stories. That was the grim reality of travel for the poor in the Middle Ages: barns, shrines, churchyards, and a lot of fleas. But while peasants struggled to survive the road, another group was busy turning fashion into politics. Because in Tudor England, clothing wasn't just clothing. It was power, law, and propaganda stitched into every sleeve, and what they wore could get you fined. Or worse, Tudor fashion: power, status, and spectacle. In Tudor England, fashion wasn't just about looking good. It was politics. It was propaganda. It was survival. Every stitch, every jewel, every color shouted something about your place in society. In fact, what you wore could mean the difference between blending into the social hierarchy or being fined, shamed, or even punished for daring to dress above your station. This wasn't a world where dress however you want applied. This was a world where clothing was law. Imagine living in a time when the government told you what colors you were allowed to wear. That's exactly what happened under the Tudor monarchy. The infamous sumptuary laws dictated who could wear what: velvet, reserved for nobility; gold embroidery, restricted to the highest ranks; purple, that was for royalty alone. Break the rules, and you risked fines, public humiliation, or worse, being accused of arrogance, which in a monarchy ruled by volatile kings and queens was a dangerous game. These laws weren't just about vanity. They were about control. If a commoner dressed like a noble, it blurred the social order. The monarchy wanted clothing to act as a billboard of class, visible proof of where you stood in the hierarchy. And so, fashion became a silent performance of obedience. Obey the code, stay safe. Break it, and you painted a target on your back. If one piece of clothing screamed Tudor, it was the ruff. What began as a small frill peeking from the collar exploded into a gigantic, starched, halo-like wheel around the neck. By Elizabeth I's reign, ruffs had grown into architectural marvels, perfectly pleated circles of linen and lace that made turning your head practically impossible. The bigger the ruff, the bigger the statement. Wearing one wasn't practical, it was the opposite. You couldn't work in it, bend in it, or even eat easily while wearing it. That was the point. Ruff said, "I don't labor, I don't sweat. I am wealthy enough to wear something this ridiculous." Maintaining a ruff was a nightmare. Servants had to wash, starch, and iron them with poking sticks to keep every fold crisp. A sagging ruff wasn't just sloppy, it was social disaster. But for nobles, the effort was worth it. A ruff framed the face like a painting, drawing attention to powdered skin, jewels, and the carefully cultivated image of wealth and superiority. Another Tudor obsession was the slashed sleeve. It looked as though someone had taken a knife to their clothing in a fit of rage, leaving it shredded. But this wasn't vandalism, it was fashion. The outer fabric was deliberately cut open to reveal a more luxurious layer beneath, usually silk or velvet. The origin story comes from soldiers who ripped their clothes on the battlefield and stuffed them with captured fabrics for warmth. Nobles saw the style and turned it into a courtly trend. By the height of the Tudor period, sleeves, doublets, and even gowns were slashed into carefully patterned cuts, puffing out brilliant fabrics underneath. It wasn't practical. It snagged easily, required endless repairs, and wasted expensive cloth. But that was the point. Waste itself became a status symbol. Only the wealthy could afford to destroy perfectly good clothing just to show off another layer beneath. For the poor, imitating the trend could be dangerous. Sumptuary laws regulated not just colors and fabrics, but also styles. A peasant daring to flaunt slashed sleeves risked being mocked or punished. For noble women, especially queens, fashion reached its peak in the jeweled gown. These weren't dresses, they were walking fortresses of wealth. Velvet, satin, and silk were embroidered with gold thread, pearls, rubies, and sapphires. Some gowns were so heavy with jewels that the wearer could barely move without assistance. Elizabeth I perfected this look. She appeared draped in pearls, a symbol of purity, projecting herself as the Virgin Queen. Ambassadors described her as glowing, her gowns catching the light like a living jewel. Every gem carried symbolism: pearls for purity, rubies for power, gold for divine favor. Clothing became propaganda, each detail reinforcing the queen's authority. But it wasn't just symbolism, it was intimidation. When Elizabeth entered a room glittering in pearls and gold, no one saw a frail woman, they saw a monarch cloaked in divine radiance. If women dazzled with gowns, men shocked with the codpiece. What started as a modest piece of fabric to cover the gap in men's hose turned into an exaggerated, padded, often jeweled pouch that made the male groin the centerpiece of fashion. By Henry VIII's time, codpieces had ballooned to absurd proportions. Some were stuffed with fabric, others reinforced with wire, and the boldest were decorated with embroidery or jewels. For Henry, the codpiece was propaganda. In his youth, it emphasized his virility and athleticism. Later, when illness and obesity weakened him, it projected an image of strength and fertility he no longer had. Some even believe he used it to conceal medical dressings. For nobles and soldiers, codpieces became symbols of masculinity and courage. Portraits show commanders with codpieces as large as their swords, fashion blending sexual bravado with military pride. But by the end of Elizabeth's reign, the codpiece had fallen out of favor. It was too ridiculous, too impractical, and too tied to a past king's insecurities. Still, for a few decades, it ruled as the most audacious fashion statement of the age. The language of color. In Tudor England, color wasn't decoration, it was identity. Each dye carried meaning and a price. Purple, reserved almost entirely for royalty, made from rare dyes requiring thousands of shellfish. To wear purple was to declare yourself divine. Scarlet and crimson, colors of nobility and ambition, created from costly imported dyes. Deep red cloaks marked power and wealth. Black, surprisingly, one of the most expensive colors. Achieving a deep, uniform black required multiple layers of dye. For Elizabeth I, black embroidered with pearls symbolized dignity and restraint. Green and blue, more affordable, but rich in symbolism: green for fertility, blue for piety. Brown, gray, dull green, the colors of peasants, dyed cheaply with local plants. Practical, durable, and designed to hide dirt. To wear colors above your station was dangerous. It wasn't just breaking fashion, it was breaking the law. Just as important as color was texture. The wealthy draped themselves in silk, velvet, satin, and damask fabrics imported at great cost. Silk shimmered in candlelight. Velvet carried weight and seriousness. Satin gleamed like liquid. Even fur carried hierarchy. Sable and lynx lined noble coats, while peasants made do with rabbit or fox. Henry VIII adored fur, often appearing swaddled in it to amplify his larger-than-life image. For the poor, coarse wool and rough linen were the norm. But among nobles, even wool was transformed, dyed rich colors, finely woven and carefully tailored. Texture itself became a social weapon. Smooth against rough, glossy against matte, the contrast reminded everyone of who lived above labor and who didn't. No Tudor outfit was complete without accessories. For men, hats were essential. Flat caps adorned with feathers and jeweled pins turned heads. Henry VIII was rarely seen without one, his broad furs framing his face. For women, hoods were the ultimate accessory. The French hood, popularized by Anne Boleyn, revealed a hint of hair and carried French sophistication. The gabled hood, favored by Catherine of Aragon, was more severe, framing the face like a pointed roof. Each choice was political as much as personal. Jewelry, too, was essential. Pearls, gold chains, jeweled girdles, and rings on every finger. At Elizabeth's court, dripping in jewels wasn't vanity, it was survival. To appear poorly adorned was to appear powerless. Even shoes carried meaning. Men wore broad, duckbill shoes, sometimes slashed to show fabric beneath. Women's shoes, often hidden under long gowns, were crafted from velvet or silk. For the wealthy, platform pattens elevated shoes above the mud, a practical necessity in streets that doubled as sewers. Every feather, every jewel, every shoe buckle was another line in the language of power. For the Tudor nobility, fashion was both privilege and prison. Yes, they glittered in jewels and velvet, but those luxuries came at staggering costs. Families bankrupted themselves to keep up appearances. To arrive at court poorly dressed was political suicide. Clothing became a battlefield, alliances formed, rivalries sharpened, and ambitions revealed in every ruff and every sleeve. For the poor, the contrast was stark. Their rough wool tunics and drab dresses marked them as firmly outside the spectacle. Clothing reminded them daily of their place in a hierarchy that was stitched into every seam. And yet, the legacy of Tudor fashion lives on. When we imagine the Tudors, we picture ruffs, jeweled gowns, and codpieces. These clothes were more than fabric. They were politics, propaganda, and performance. Henry VIII swaddled in fur and codpieces, Elizabeth I draped in pearls and symbolism. These weren't just outfits, they were statements of power. Fashion became armor, armor of silk, lace, jewels, and starch. And centuries later, the image of Tudor clothing still conjures wealth, authority, and excess. So, peasants trudged through mud and begged for a corner in a barn, while nobles bankrupted themselves to parade in ruffs and jewels. But while England was weaving politics into its clothing, far to the east another spectacle was unfolding. Because in the medieval Arab world, the true heartbeat of the city wasn't in palaces or mosques, it was in the bazaar. A place of spices, silks, music, gossip, and power. And walking into one was like stepping into the center of the world. The medieval Arab bazaar, the heartbeat of the city. If medieval Europe's peasants were stumbling through barns, shrines, and taverns, the medieval Arab world had something very different. In Cairo, Baghdad, or Damascus, the true soul of the city wasn't hidden in castles or cloisters. It was alive, loud, and unforgettable in one place, the bazaar. Step into it, and you'd be overwhelmed. The smells, the sounds, the colors, it wasn't just a market. It was theater, it was gossip, it was politics. It was life itself. Picture it, winding alleys draped in awnings to block the sun. Stalls overflowing with goods from every corner of the known world. Merchants shouting, buyers haggling, children darting between donkeys and camels loaded with goods. The air itself was a perfume of empire saffron from India, musk from Central Asia, frankincense from Arabia, cinnamon and cloves from the Indonesian Isles, fresh bread from clay ovens, roasted lamb sizzling on skewers. Every step was another sensation. Every stall was another story. The bazaar wasn't just shopping, it was immersion. If the bazaar had a signature, it was its fragrance. Spice merchants dominated entire alleys, their stalls piled high with saffron threads, peppercorns, nutmeg, and cardamom pods. To buy saffron was to buy wealth itself measured out carefully like treasure. Perfume sellers added another layer. Bottles of rosewater, musk, amber, and sandalwood filled the air. Perfume wasn't luxury, it was identity. In Islamic culture, scent reflected piety, refinement, even morality. The Prophet himself praised perfume, and the wealthy used it as both status and devotion. Buying wasn't silent, it was performance. Merchants urged you to inhale spices, rub oils on your wrists, listen to exaggerated tales of their origins, and you haggled. Oh, you always haggled. Paying the first price was shameful. The argument was part of the transaction. Walk out of the bazaar with cinnamon in your pouch or rose oil on your clothes, and you weren't just carrying goods, you were carrying proof of wealth, culture, and connection. If spices gave the bazaar its fragrance, textiles gave it its color. Bolts of silk glowed like liquid light. Cotton from Egypt dyed in bright blues and reds stacked in high bundles. Persian carpets spread across the ground, their patterns alive with geometry and flowers, each not a story. Silk was the crown jewel. Imported from China and Central Asia, it was the ultimate luxury. Nobles wore it, rulers gifted it, and merchants bragged about it. To own silk was to participate in empire. Carpets were another treasure. Functional, yes, but also prayer spaces, heirlooms, and symbols of prestige. Buyers inspected the knots, traced the patterns, and imagined them in homes, mosques, or courts. And the act of buying cloth was ritual. You held it to the light, tugged the weave, argued fiercely, and finally shook hands with a blessing. May God bring you profit. But the bazaar wasn't just smell and sight, it was sound. Merchants chanting the prices of figs, dates, or copper pots. Buyers shouting back. Laughter when a deal was sealed. Street musicians filled the gaps with the pluck of lutes, the beat of drums, and the melodies of flutes. Coffeehouse owners hired them to attract crowds, turning stalls into stages. And then there were the storytellers, the hakawadis. In shaded courtyards, men gathered around as a narrator spun tales of heroes like Enter, or episodes from 1001 Nights. Crowds gasped, chuckled, and returned day after day to hear the next chapter. Add to that the animals, donkeys braying, camels groaning, water sellers shouting, and you had a living symphony. The bazaar wasn't noise, it was rhythm. It was music in motion, Behind the colors and chaos, the bazaar was political. Every good that passed through its gates was taxed. The bazaar funded armies, mosques, and palaces. Market inspectors called muhtasibs patrolled the stalls, checking weights, punishing fraud, and enforcing fairness. A rigged scale could mean flogging or losing your shop entirely. Rulers also knew the bazaar was where public opinion lived. Gossip about court scandals, wars, or taxes spread faster than any courier. Governors planted informants among the crowds, listening for unrest. And sometimes rulers themselves staged appearances. Edicts were read in market squares. Grain was distributed during famine. Leaders knew control the bazaar, and you controlled the lifeblood of the city. But it wasn't one-sided. People had power too. Collective boycotts or market protests could ripple upward, forcing rulers to respond. The bazaar wasn't just commerce, it was a stage for negotiation between rulers and ruled. Faith was never separate from the bazaar. 5 times a day, the call to prayer rose from minarets, halting transactions. Shopkeepers covered stalls, customers paused mid-haggle, and men streamed toward mosques. The bazaar fell silent, then roared back to life when prayer ended. Charity was everywhere. Merchants gave portions of profit as zakat. Wealthy patrons built water fountains or public kitchens at bazaar entrances, ensuring the poor weren't forgotten. To refuse generosity was to risk both divine and social scorn. Even goods carried faith. Butchers followed Islamic rules of slaughter. Scribes sold Quranic verses beside poetry. Perfume sellers invoked hadiths about cleanliness. Faith wasn't tucked away in mosques, it lived openly in the lanes of the market. And during festivals like Ramadan or Eid, the bazaar itself became celebration. Lanterns lit the streets, sweet sellers displayed honey cakes, and families in their finest clothes filled the alleys. What made the medieval Arab bazaar truly unique was its global reach. Here, you could find Persian carpets, Indian spices, African ivory, Central Asian horses, Greek glass, Italian wines, and Chinese silks. Each stall was a window into another world. Arabic served as the lingua franca, letting Persians, Indians, Greeks, and Africans all bargain together. Diplomats strolled the stalls as much as merchants. Deals struck here could shift alliances, and knowledge flowed with goods. Booksellers sold volumes of philosophy, medicine, and astronomy, often translated from Greek, Persian, or Sanskrit. A manuscript bought in Baghdad might end up in Andalusia, shaping scholars in Europe. The bazaar was more than trade. It was an engine of globalization centuries before the word existed. The bazaar was also the city's entertainment hub. Coffee houses became social centers where men debated poetry, politics, and theology over steaming cups of cardamom coffee. Street performers juggled, charmed snakes, or showed off trained monkeys. Musicians played, dancers spun, and laughter mingled with bargaining. Storytellers drew crowds like celebrities. Each tale was a cliffhanger, keeping audiences hooked and returning. In many ways, they were the Netflix of their time, serial content that bound communities together. Women, too, found space here, shopping for fabrics, perfumes, or food, often accompanied by relatives. Friendships were forged, dowries negotiated, alliances strengthened. The bazaar wasn't just a place to buy, it was a place to live, connect, and belong. When night finally fell, stalls closed, lanterns dimmed, and storytellers finished their last tales, the bazaar rested. But its legacy lived on, because the medieval Arab bazaar wasn't just a market, it was a treasury funding cities. a stage for politics, a theater of entertainment, a temple of faith, a crossroads of civilizations. It was the heartbeat of the city where trade, culture, and humanity merged into one. So think about it. In medieval Europe, peasants trudged through mud, begging for a corner in a barn or a patch of straw in a tavern. In Tudor England, nobles bankrupted themselves for ruffs, jewels, and codpieces that screamed their status. And in the Arab world, bazaars pulsed with life where spices, silks, politics, and poetry collided in a dazzling display of civilization at its peak. Different worlds, different struggles. But one truth tied them all together. In history, where you slept, what you wore, and where you shopped weren't just daily routines. They were survival, they were identity, they were power. And those choices still echo centuries later.